The mess hall at Leavenworth could seat over 1,000 men at once. Long wooden tables, tin trays, and the smell of roast beef drifting out of a kitchen staffed entirely by inmates. This was not a restaurant. This was one of the most feared federal penitentiaries in American history, and the meals coming out of that kitchen would have put most family tables to shame. Number 14 on this list fed a whole population from livestock the prisoners raised themselves. Number 6 was churned fresh behind the same walls that held the country's most wanted. And number 1 sat across from men whose names made national headlines. Hit that subscribe button, because what these inmates actually ate will change how you think about every prison meal you have ever seen in a movie. Here are 25 wild meals actually served to inmates at Leavenworth Penitentiary. Number 25. Fresh baked bread. Every morning before the sun came up, the Leavenworth bakery fired its ovens and turned out hundreds of loaves of white bread. The operation ran like a commercial bakery, staffed entirely by inmates who had been trained on the job inside the walls. The flour came from wheat grown on the prison's own farmland, and the dough was mixed, shaped, and baked from scratch every single day without exception. Loaves came out warm, and the smell drifted through the corridors before most men were even awake. Families across Kansas in the early 1900s would have recognized that smell from their own kitchens. The difference was that this bread was baked behind 30-foot concrete walls by men serving federal sentences. For many inmates, it was the one thing about Leavenworth that felt almost normal. Number 24. Oatmeal and molasses. Breakfast at Leavenworth was not optional, and it was not varied. Every inmate sat down to a bowl of oatmeal, thick and heavy, sweetened with dark molasses and served alongside bread and black coffee. It arrived on the tray every morning without variation. The oatmeal was cooked in enormous iron kettles in the main kitchen and ladled out by the hundreds. There was no menu, no substitution, no complaint box. You ate what was placed in front of you, and in the morning, that meant oats. For men doing hard labor on the prison farm or in the industrial shops, it was fuel and nothing more. For men who could not stand oatmeal, it was a daily reminder that nothing inside this place was designed around personal preference. The molasses was the one mercy. Without it, the bowl was nearly inedible. Number 23. Tripe and onions. The kitchen at Leavenworth wasted nothing from the animals raised and slaughtered on the prison grounds, and that included the stomach lining. Tripe showed up in the mess hall simmered low with onions until the rubbery white sheets turned soft enough to chew without a fight. The texture was something most men never forgot. It had a chewiness that no amount of cooking could fully eliminate, and a faint barnyard smell that hung over the tables long after the trays were cleared. Some inmates refused it outright. Others loaded it with salt and pepper and ate it fast, treating it the way they treated most things at Leavenworth, as fuel and nothing more. The men who had grown up on farms or come from Eastern European families recognized it immediately. For them it was familiar, maybe even welcome. For everyone else, it was one of those meals that reminded you exactly where you were. The guards ate the same food, and on tripe days, even they looked like they would rather be somewhere else. Number 22. Roast beef with brown gravy. This was the meal that stunned new inmates the most. On certain days each week, the kitchen carved fresh roast beef and served it with thick brown gravy ladled over boiled potatoes. The beef came from cattle raised on the prison grounds, slaughtered and butchered by inmates who had been trained in the prison's own meatpacking operation. It was not fine dining by any stretch, but it was real beef, properly cooked, and served hot. Visitors and freshly transferred inmates often could not believe what they were looking at on the tray. A federal penitentiary known for housing bank robbers, kidnappers, and organized crime figures was putting out a roast dinner that most working families in the 1920s and 30s would have been glad to sit down to on a Sunday afternoon. Number 21. Whole milk from the prison dairy herd. Leavenworth kept its own cows, and the milk served in the mess hall came directly from that herd. It was whole, rich, and fresh in a way that almost nothing in a modern grocery store comes close to matching. Inmates handled the milking themselves as part of the daily work assignments. The cream rose to the top of every jug, and the kitchen used the surplus to churn butter. In an era when regular milk delivery was still a luxury in parts of rural America, inmates at a federal penitentiary in Kansas were drinking fresh whole milk with every meal 3 times a day. It was one of those quiet details that made outsiders shake their heads. The men behind the walls were getting better dairy than many of the families living freely on the other side. Number 20. Cow tongue sandwiches. The kitchen at Leavenworth wasted nothing from the cattle it slaughtered on the grounds, and that included the tongue. A full beef tongue was simmered for hours until the outer skin peeled away, then sliced thin and served cold between 2 pieces of bread with pickles and mustard. The texture was dense and smooth, almost like a fine deli cut, and the flavor was richer than any roast beef coming out of the same kitchen. Most of the men eating it had never seen a tongue served as food before arriving at the penitentiary. In the world outside, butchers in the Midwest sold tongue cheaply to anyone willing to cook it, but it rarely showed up on a family dinner table. Inside the walls, there was no squeamishness allowed. You ate what the kitchen prepared, or you went without. And the men who got past the idea of what they were chewing discovered something the prison cooks already knew. Tongue, prepared correctly, was one of the best cuts of meat on the animal. Number 19. Corn on the cob. When the summer harvest came in, inmates at Leavenworth ate corn that had been growing in the fields just outside the prison walls that same morning. The ears were boiled whole in the main kitchen and served with nothing but salt. Kansas is corn country, and the prison operation took full advantage of the climate and the soil. During peak growing season, the corn came in by the cartload. Inmates who worked the farm detail shucked the ears and hauled them directly to the kitchen doors, still warm from the sun. There was something almost absurd about the picture. Men in federal custody eating sweet corn off the cob, while armed guards watched from the towers above the yard. But that was daily life at Leavenworth. The farm did not care about the criminal record of the man holding the ear. It just kept producing, and the kitchen kept cooking, and the mess hall kept filling up 3 times a day. Number 18. Liver and onions. This was not a popular tray. Liver showed up on the mess hall schedule whether anyone wanted it or not, fried in heavy skillets with thick rings of white onion piled on top. The kitchen served it because it was nutritious, and because the liver came from the same cattle the prison was already slaughtering for roast beef and stew. Nothing on the animal was wasted. Some men ate it without a word of complaint. Others pushed it to the edge of the tray and filled up on bread and coffee instead. But the kitchen took no requests. Liver was cheap protein. It used parts of the animal that would otherwise be discarded, and it satisfied a nutritional standard the federal system required every penitentiary to meet. Whether it tasted good was not part of the calculation, and no one in the administration lost any sleep over it. Number 17. Bean soup. The mess hall went through staggering quantities of dried beans. Navy beans, pinto beans, and whatever else the prison farm could grow were soaked overnight, simmered for hours in enormous pots with salt pork and onion, and ladled out by the gallon. Bean soup appeared on the weekly rotation multiple times, and no inmate who spent any real time at Leavenworth could claim he had not eaten more of it than he ever wanted to. It was the backbone of the prison diet, the meal the kitchen could always fall back on. Cheap to produce, nearly impossible to ruin at scale, and filling enough to keep men working through the afternoon. Former inmates who later wrote about their time inside almost always mentioned the beans, not because they missed them, but because there was no way to forget them. The beans followed you out the gate. Number 16. Pork chops from the prison hog farm. Leavenworth raised its own hogs on the grounds surrounding the penitentiary, and when those hogs were ready, The kitchen turned out pork chops that rivaled anything coming off a farmhouse stove in rural Kansas. The chops were seasoned simply, fried or baked depending on the day, and served alongside whatever sides the kitchen had prepared. The hog operation was part of the prison's larger push to be entirely self-sustaining. Inmates fed the animals, cleaned the pens, and handled the butchering under supervision. The pork that landed on their trays had been raised, slaughtered, and cooked entirely within the same perimeter fence. It was a closed loop that most modern farms would struggle to match, and the chops, plain as they were, tasted like they came from an animal that had been fed properly and handled with care, because they had. Number 15. Biscuits and sausage gravy. On certain mornings, the mess hall served hot biscuits split open and smothered in a thick white gravy made from pan drippings, flour, milk, and crumbled sausage. The sausage came from the prison's own pork supply, ground and seasoned in the kitchen. It was the kind of breakfast that belonged in a roadside diner in the rural South, not inside the walls of a federal penitentiary in Kansas. But Leavenworth was a reflection of the men locked inside it, and a large number of those men came from parts of the country where biscuits and gravy was what you ate on Sunday morning before church. The kitchen understood what kept the population calm. Familiar food went a long way behind high walls. A tray of biscuits and gravy could soften the edges of a morning that started with a head count and a locked door. Number 14. Beef stew. This is where the full picture of Leavenworth's food system comes into focus. The penitentiary operated one of the largest self-sustaining farm networks in the entire federal prison system. Hundreds of acres of cropland surrounded the facility, worked by inmates under armed supervision from dawn until the light gave out. Cattle grazed on prison pastures. Hogs were penned and fattened on prison-grown grain. A dairy herd supplied fresh milk, cream, and butter. Orchards produced apples and stone fruit. Vegetable gardens stretched in long rows across the Kansas flatland, turning out potatoes, onions, carrots, cabbage, and beans by the ton, season after season. And at the center of it all sat the main kitchen, a cavernous operation that took everything the farm produced and converted it into meals for a population that regularly topped 1,000 men, 3 times a day, every single day of the year. Beef stew was the clearest expression of that entire machine. The potatoes, the onions, the carrots, and the beef itself all came from inside the fence line. The stew simmered for hours in kettles large enough for a man to stand inside, thickened with flour milled from prison wheat, and served in portions built for men doing hard physical labor from sunrise to dark. There was no garnish, no presentation, no choice of sides. But the ingredients were fresh, the portions were honest, and the men eating it had planted, harvested, raised, slaughtered, or cooked every single component with their own hands. The warden understood something that most people on the outside never considered. A population of dangerous men who have just eaten a hot, filling meal made from real food is a fundamentally different problem than a population of the same men running on empty. Beef stew was not just dinner, it was stability, and every bowl of it kept the institution running for one more day. Number 13. Spaghetti and meatballs. By the 1930s, Italian-American cooking had worked its way into institutional kitchens across the country, and Leavenworth was no exception. The kitchen turned out spaghetti in large batches, topped with a tomato sauce made from canned tomatoes and served with ground beef meatballs seasoned with garlic and onion. It was not authentic by any standard an Italian grandmother would have recognized, but it was hot, it had flavor, and it broke the monotony of roast beef and bean soup in a way that most other meals on the rotation could not. For inmates from Italian neighborhoods in New York or Chicago, it was a distant echo of something they once knew. For everyone else, it was simply different. And different on a schedule that repeated the same 7 or 8 meals week after week was enough to make spaghetti night one of the few evenings the mess hall actually looked forward to. Number 12. fried catfish on Fridays. The federal prison system followed a long-standing tradition of serving fish on Fridays, rooted in Catholic dietary practice, and at Leavenworth that usually meant catfish. The kitchen breaded it in seasoned flour and fried it in deep skillets in large batches, and the smell carried through the corridors well before the mess hall doors swung open. Served alongside coleslaw and bread, it was one of the lighter meals on the weekly schedule and a genuine change of pace from the heavier beef and pork that dominated the rest of the week. Men who had grown up fishing rivers and creeks across the South and the Midwest recognized it immediately. The breading, the crunch, the soft white flesh underneath. For one meal each week, the mess hall smelled less like an institution and more like a fish fry on the banks of a river somewhere back home. Number 11. Apple pie from the prison orchard. The orchards on the Leavenworth grounds produced enough apples each fall to keep the bakery turning out pies well into the winter months. The pies were baked in large rectangular sheet pans, cut into squares and served as dessert alongside the main meal. The crust was plain and sturdy, the filling sweetened with sugar and a touch of cinnamon, and the whole thing tasted like it had come out of a farmhouse kitchen in the Midwest, because in every way that mattered, it had. Nothing about these pies was decorative or refined. They were apples and dough assembled in the right proportions by men who baked hundreds of loaves of bread before breakfast. But dessert of any kind inside a federal penitentiary was a privilege, not a guarantee. Apple pie carried more weight behind bars than it ever carried on a family table. Men who followed the rules ate pie. Men who did not eat bread. That quiet distinction shaped behavior more effectively than most of the written regulations posted on the walls. Number 10. Cinnamon rolls from the prison bakery. The same ovens that produced hundreds of loaves of bread every morning also turned out cinnamon rolls. Soft, dense, rolled tight with cinnamon and brown sugar, and glazed while still warm. They were a breakfast item that had absolutely no business showing up inside a maximum security federal penitentiary, and yet there they sat on the tray, right next to the oatmeal and the coffee. The bakers who produced them were inmates who had learned the craft entirely within the walls, and some of them got good enough to have held their own in any commercial bakery on the outside. These were not frozen rolls reheated in a sheet pan. They were made from scratch using the prison's own flour, rolled by hand and baked fresh. In a place that was deliberately designed to strip away comfort, a warm cinnamon roll was a quiet rebellion by the kitchen. Number 9. Brain sandwiches. In the early decades of Leavenworth's operation, the prison slaughterhouse produced cuts of meat that most modern kitchens would refuse to touch. Calf brains were one of them. The brains were soaked in cold water, cleaned, sliced, dredged in seasoned flour, and fried in lard until the outside turned golden and crisp. Then they were placed on bread and served to the mess hall. The taste was mild and creamy, closer to scrambled eggs than anything resembling muscle meat. Across the Midwest, brain sandwiches were common diner fare well into the middle of the 20th century, especially in Indiana, Missouri, and parts of Kansas. The prison kitchen treated them no differently than any other protein that came off the slaughter line. Nothing was discarded if it could feed the population. For men who had never encountered the dish, the first bite required a deliberate act of will. For men who had grown up eating them at county fairs and roadside lunch counters, it was just another Tuesday. Number 8. Pickled pig's feet. The hog operation at Leavenworth generated more than chops and sausage. The feet were cleaned, split, and submerged in a brine of vinegar, salt, and spices, then packed into large crocks and left to cure in the prison storerooms. When they appeared on the mess hall tray, they arrived cold, glistening, and gelatinous, with a sharp vinegar tang that cut through the monotony of the usual hot meals. Eating them required pulling the soft, slippery meat away from a tangle of small bones with your fingers. There was no dignified way to do it. Across the rural South and the lower Midwest, pickled pig's feet sat in jars on the counter of nearly every general store and corner bar. They were poor food, working food, and they carried no pretension whatsoever. Inside Leavenworth, they served the same function. A cold jar of pig's feet on a hot Kansas afternoon was cheap, filling, and required no cooking at all. The kitchen loved them for that reason alone. Number 7. Chili con carne. Chili was more than a meal at Leavenworth. It was an institution inside the institution. The kitchen made it in batches so large that the pots had to be stirred with wooden paddles the length of boat oars. Ground beef from the prison herd, kidney beans from the farm, tomatoes, onions, chili powder, and whatever spices the cooks could get their hands on all went into the pot, and the whole thing simmered for hours until the flavors merged into something that had no single regional origin, but somehow belonged to everyone who tasted it. Men from Texas said it needed more heat. Men from the upper Midwest thought it was fine the way it was. Men from the East Coast had never eaten a bowl of chili before arriving at Leavenworth and had no idea whose side to take. The argument never settled, and that was exactly what made it valuable. Chili gave inmates something to hold a strong opinion about that had nothing to do with their sentence, their cellmate, or the guard standing at the end of the tier. It was a safe disagreement in a building where most disagreements turned dangerous fast. The kitchen served it with cornbread and raw onion on the side, and the line for second helpings stretched longer than for any other meal on the rotation. Unlike most items at Leavenworth, chili was one of the few where the kitchen did not strictly enforce portion limits. If the pot was not empty, a man could go back for another bowl. That single policy, small as it sounds, did more for the mood inside the walls than any disciplinary program or warden's speech ever managed. A man who can choose to eat a second bowl of something feels, for just that moment, like a man who still has a choice. In a place where every other decision, when to wake, when to eat, when to stand, when to sleep, was made by someone in a uniform, that small moment of agency carried a weight that had nothing to do with chili and everything to do with being human. Number 6. Ice cream churned on site. This is the one that catches people off guard. Leavenworth had its own dairy herd, its own fresh cream, and inmates who had been trained to operate a hand-crank churn. The result was ice cream, made from scratch behind the walls of one of the most notorious federal penitentiaries in the country, using milk and cream produced entirely on the prison grounds. It was served on holidays and occasionally on summer weekends, and the flavor was almost always plain vanilla. Nothing elaborate, but the fact that it existed at all was the remarkable part. This was a facility that housed men convicted of kidnapping, racketeering, and armed robbery. And on a warm afternoon, those same men sat in the mess hall eating ice cream that had been frozen by hand that same morning. The logic behind it was purely practical. The dairy herd produced more cream than the kitchen could use in regular cooking, and someone in the administration decided that letting it spoil was a worse outcome than letting inmates enjoy it. That reasoning, accidentally generous, defined more of life inside Leavenworth than any official policy ever did. Number 5. Christmas dinner. Once a year, the Leavenworth kitchen produced a holiday spread that had no business existing inside a federal penitentiary. Roast turkey with bread stuffing, mashed potatoes drowning in gravy, cranberry sauce, fresh rolls from the prison bakery, and pie for dessert. The warden authorized the full menu, and the kitchen crew, all inmates, worked through the night carving birds and rolling dough. The mess hall on Christmas morning looked and smelled like a family dining room, which was exactly what made it strange. These were men serving decades for bank robbery, kidnapping, and murder, sitting elbow to elbow with plates that could have come from any home in Kansas. The ones with families on the outside ate slowly and said almost nothing. The ones with no one left ate the same food in the same silence, for different reasons. By the afternoon, the trays were cleared, the kitchen was scrubbed, and the routine returned as if none of it had happened. That single meal was the wildest contradiction Leavenworth served all year, not because of what was on the plate, but because of how completely it pretended the walls were not there. Number 4. Head cheese from the prison slaughterhouse. When the hogs were butchered at Leavenworth, the heads did not go to waste. The entire head was boiled for hours until every scrap of meat fell away from the skull. Then the meat was chopped, mixed with the natural gelatin from the cooking liquid, seasoned with vinegar and black pepper, pressed into loaf pans and chilled until it set firm. The result was head cheese, sliced cold and served on bread or eaten straight off the tray. It looked like a mosaic of pale meat suspended in trembling jelly. The taste was porky and sour, and the texture made some men put down their forks after the first bite. But head cheese had deep roots in German, Polish, and Southern cooking, and a fair number of inmates recognized it from their childhoods. The prison made it because the raw material was free and the preparation was simple. One hog head fed dozens of men, in a facility designed to stretch every dollar and every animal as far as it could go. Head cheese was not a punishment. It was pure institutional logic carried to its most unsettling conclusion. Number 3. The bread and water punishment ration. Not every meal at Leavenworth surprised in the good direction. For inmates who broke the rules, the punishment was simple and devastating. They were pulled from the population and placed in isolation where their diet was stripped to bread and water, nothing else. No meat, no vegetables, no coffee, no oatmeal. Just bread and a cup of water, pushed through a slot in the door several times a day for days on end. The cruelty was in the contrast. A man who had been eating roast beef, fried chicken, fresh milk, and pie the week before was suddenly surviving on a ration a medieval prisoner would have recognized. The message was unmistakable. The good food at Leavenworth was not a right. It was a privilege, and it could vanish completely in a single afternoon. That knowledge kept more men in line than any posted regulation ever did. When the punishment ended and a man walked back into the mess hall and sat down to a bowl of bean soup, that soup tasted better than anything he had ever eaten. Number 2. Robert Stroud's isolation meals. Robert Stroud, the man who would later become famous as the Birdman of Alcatraz, spent years locked inside Leavenworth before his transfer to the island prison in San Francisco Bay. After killing a guard within the penitentiary walls, Stroud was placed into permanent solitary confinement, and he never set foot in the mess hall again. His meals were delivered to his cell on a tray, pushed through a narrow slot in the door, 3 times a day, every day, for years, that eventually stretched into decades. He ate the same food the general population ate, prepared in the same kitchen, served on the same kind of tray, but he ate it alone. There was no sound of 1,000 men talking and scraping their forks against tin, no line for seconds, no comment about the chili being too mild, just a tray, a cell, and silence. Over time, Stroud turned his attention to the canaries he was allowed to keep, and the legend of the Birdman slowly began to take shape. But before the birds, before the books he wrote about them, before Alcatraz, before the movie, there were years of meals eaten in total solitude inside Leavenworth. Breakfast pushed through a slot, lunch pushed through a slot, dinner pushed through a slot, a tray picked up, eaten at a small table bolted to the wall, and pushed back through the same slot when the food was gone. That cycle, repeated thousands upon thousands of times, is what isolation actually looks like when you strip away every layer of mythology built on top of it. It is not dramatic. It is not cinematic. It is a man eating a plate of beef stew alone in a room that never changes, doing it again the next morning and the morning after that, until the months and years lose their shape and every meal blurs quietly into the one that came before. Stroud consumed more meals alone inside federal walls than most people share with their families in an entire lifetime. That single fact tells you more about what Leavenworth truly was than any warden's annual report ever committed to paper. Number 1. Machine Gun Kelly in the Mess Hall. George Kelly Barnes, the man the newspapers called Machine Gun Kelly, arrived at Leavenworth after his conviction for kidnapping a wealthy Oklahoma oil man. His name had been printed in bold type on front pages from coast to coast. And when he walked into the mess hall for the first time, he sat down at the same long table as every other inmate and picked up the same tin tray. Meat, potatoes, bread, and coffee. The same food 1,000 other men were eating at the same moment. No special table, no private kitchen, no recognition of the name that had terrified an entire nation weeks earlier. Kelly ate. He returned his tray. He walked back to his cell. He did the same thing every day for years. The man the public feared as a machine gun-wielding kidnapper sat in a Kansas mess hall eating bean soup with a tin spoon next to a check forger on his left and a bootlegger across the table. That is what Leavenworth ultimately was. A place where the food was better than anyone imagined, and where the men eating it were exactly as ordinary as everyone else once you stripped the headlines away. Every meal served in that mess hall, from the roast beef to the chili to the Christmas turkey, told the same quiet truth. These were just men, sitting at a table, eating. Those are 25 wild meals actually served to inmates at Leavenworth Penitentiary, a place where the food came from the same soil the prisoners worked with their own hands, and where a hot meal was often the only thing standing between order and chaos. Which one of these meals surprised you the most? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time, because we have a lot more meals that history tried to bury, and you do not want to miss what is coming next.